A couple of videos ago, we looked at this really slick nav that Stripe has on its pricing page. And when you hover over top of it, of course, it shows the drop down. But the really cool part about it is that the background of the drop down seems to be able to transform itself from the width and the height, as well as wherever it is on the page. So it's X and its Y coordinates. And when I first saw that, I was like, how did they do that? That's incredible. And what I found out is that the drop downs themselves, like the content, the text here, those are separate elements. But there's this sort of like little puppy div that follows each of those drop downs around and will resize itself based on wherever it is on the page. So this white thing that you see moving, that's the actual background that's just moving itself around. And it's just sort of absolutely positioned behind those elements. And we did a really simple example like that in a couple days ago when we hovered over a link. We had a little div that would sort of resize itself and go behind where that element is. So today we're going to step it up a little bit and build something like this, which is a proof of concept Stripe navigation. Looks a little bit different, but it has the same idea where when you hover over top of one of these navigation links, it's going to resize itself. It's going to match the width and the height of the actual content and animate itself wherever it's going to go, or transition itself wherever it's going to go. Let's jump into looking at our HTML real quick. We have a nav element right here, and you could give that a class of top if you like. Then you've got a drop-down background. That's the white. That's what the white is going to follow around. You see this little white dip part? That's not three separate divs. That's just one, and it's going to follow along with the content as we go. So that's what we have. And then we have a span with a class of arrow, which is going to be that little notch that we have there. Okay, good. And you notice that I put this inside of this nav. In the last one, we just put it straight in the body so that we didn't have to worry about any like margin or padding on top of our nav here. But in this one, I want to show you how do you actually deal with this if you're trying to get the actual position of an element inside of a nav. Because it's not always your job to pick the HTML. Sometimes you have a CMS and it's going to generate that HTML for you. And I want to make sure that we're not just making this as easy as possible. And then you go to implement it in your own. You're like, oh, this is actually a little bit harder than we actually thought it was. So we've put it in here just to show you a different way to do it. Then we have unordered class with a class of cool. We have our list items. These are our LIs. We have 3 of them. We've got our link and then what's called a drop down. And the drop down can be any element. In this case, it's a div that has some info on me. In this case, it's an unordered list that has more list items inside of it. But the important thing is that these LIs, the top level LIs, they will be our triggers. They are the things that are going to be hovered on them. And the reason why these LIs are going to be the things that we hover is because if you hover onto this A link and then you try to hover into something inside of it, like Twitter, Facebook, or blog, you're technically hovering off the anchor link. And then it would trigger the off and it would fade itself out. So here what we're doing is, even though my mouse is right here, I'm still inside of this parent LI. And then we've got the second one as well as the third one. In terms of CSS, there's not a whole lot going on here. Most of this is just so it looks half decent. None of it really has anything to do with the positioning on the page other than this position relative right here that we have. We are going to be writing the CSS that is important for ourselves. So first we need the triggers, and those are those 3 LIs. So say const triggers equals document.querySelector all, and we'll say cool LI, and that's going to be all the direct descendants of that cool that are a list item. And then we also need to grab the drop-down background, which is that white div. So we'll call that background. Make sure that you use only query selector here because we don't need a node list. We need just one element. And then we'll also do that for our nav, which we put a class of top on. Then what we want to do is listen for a hover in and a hover out, or a mouse enter and a mouse leave on each of those list items. So we're going to make 2 functions here called handle enter, and we're going to make one called handle leave. Then we'll listen for the mouse enter and the mouse leave and trigger each of those functions. So I'll handle enter on that one. Then we'll just duplicate it over and we'll listen for the mouse leave event which is going to trigger our handle leave. All right, so we just wrote a bit of code there. Let's make sure that these all work. So enter and leave. Make sure we didn't get anything wrong here. So any syntax errors in our console? Nope. Then you go to your console, hover over top of them. Good. You should be getting enter and leave console logs whenever you hover in and out of any of those elements. Good. So next what we need to do is we need to break this down into two parts. First part is I just want to get the contents of the dropdown showing, meaning that if I hover over this last one, this UL here, it should show itself. I take the opacity off and the display none off. You see, there's the content for each of them. I want to show, whenever I hover over LI, I want to find the dropdown inside of it and then display it. And the way that's going to work is we're going to be adding and removing classes and then leaning on our CSS to actually do that for us. So we'll go into our handle enter function here and we will grab this. What is this? This is the list item. I'm going to put the class on the list item. Class list add, and we'll say trigger dash enter. And then what we want to do is also add a class of trigger enter active after 150 milliseconds. And this is going to become more clear as to why I've done this when we get into the second part, which is that follow along div. So we're going to say set timeout. We are going to, I'm going to show you a little trick here with arrow functions. I'm going to use a normal function here. And then I'm going to say after 150 milliseconds, this dot class list dot add trigger enter active. Now this isn't going to work. Why not? Cannot read property add of undefined. So it cannot find class list of this. And why is that? If you console log this, it gives you window. And you probably have like, yeah, Wes, you showed me this in your ES6 course. I understand it now. When you enter into a function, the value of this changes. However, if you change that into an arrow function, the value of this is inherited from the parent function, which is going to be exactly what we want. Aha, good. So we can make this into a nice little short one-liner arrow function here. There we go. Does this still work? Good. We've got it. So we've got this class list to add trigger enter active. And then we want to go into our CSS. So scroll up, and this is why I've included the CSS in the file for you here, because it's actually a bit long. It'd be better suited towards a separate CSS file. And we'll find our dropdown, which is here. And you'll notice that the way that I show the dropdown is with both, I hit it with opacity 0 and display none. And the reason why I've done that is because you cannot go from opacity 0 to 1, as well as display none to display block. So it's a bit of a pain, but what we're going to do is we're sort of going to step it where when we have trigger enter, our dropdown is going to be display block, but it's still going to be opacity 1. And I'll show you opacity 1. See, that will just immediately show it, but I want it to sort of transition itself in, which is why we have this here. So what I want to do is not put the opacity there, but after a second, we're going to have this class of trigger enter active. So watch this. See how they after 150 milliseconds, we get that second one. And then when it has a class of trigger enter active, because it is already shown with the display block just a split second earlier, then we go into our opacity and set it into V1. And this is how, if you've ever used animations in either React or Angular, this is how animations or transitions work inside of those frameworks. They just apply two separate classes when something enters or leaves, and then you can use your CSS just to do that sort of staged move there. So now if we give it a save and refresh, looks like it's not showing opacity 1. Oh, it's because I need to say .dropdown. Ah, there we go. See how they animate themselves in or transition themselves in? And then, of course, on the other side of things, we can go into our leave, and we simply just duplicate that one, and we will just remove the class of trigger enter. And then I'm going to do it all in one shot. I'm not going to animate it out. So we'll say trigger enter active. Good. You see these things are nice fading in. So that's a lot of JavaScript just to do something that CSS can do out of the box. But the next piece, and the reason why we need to do this with JavaScript is because the next piece is that we're going to figure out how big is this UL with a class of Dropdown, and then can that little white div go behind it so we get this little animation that we have here. So let's go here. First thing we need to do is get that white thing on the page. And that white thing is our background. That's what we have right here. So we'll say background.classList.add, and it's going to have a class of open. And then just duplicate that and remove it on our leave. So now we should look at our drop-down background here. And then when you hover over top of one of them, it should also add a class of open. So if we go into our CSS, we see it here. When our drop-down background also has a class of open, let's say opacity 1. You see? See that the little white guy in the corner is showing itself? Makes sense. So now we need to do, which is really the heavy lifting, is to figure out, okay, we have this drop-down, which is Twitter, Facebook, blog, course catalog. How wide, how high, and where on the page do you live so that we can take this white thing and move it on over to where that exists. So we're going to go down here below where we did all of those class lists. And first thing that we need to do is figure out what that drop down actually is. So we'll say const drop down equals this dot query selector. And we're going to be looking for a drop down. And you might be asking, like, why didn't we do that up here with our nav? Well, you can't do that here because there's 3 different drop downs and it needs to be dynamic. You need to find the one drop down that exists inside of the thing that got hovered. So if we console log that drop down, go to our console here, you should now see that we get a different drop down in the course in the console whenever we hover. Good. So we can then take the coordinates from that, just like we did in the previous one. We'll say const drop down chords is equal to drop down dot get bounding client rect, and put those together. Let's just console log drop down chords. Give it a save. So you see what's happening here is that we get information about where on the page, from the bottom, the left, the top, the right, and the width, is that actual item. Now, the other thing is that we need to get information about where the nav is, because you cannot assume that this nav tag is always going to be the first thing on the page. You might have an H2 that says hello, and when that happens, you bump everything down. And this information, it gives you information relative to where on the page it is. Absolutely on the page, and it doesn't take these things into account. So what we need to do is then grab the coordinates for the nav as well. So go down, down, down. Const nav chords is equal to nav.get bounding client rect. We should also have the coordinates for the nav. And the reason why I do that on every single time, something might change. Sometimes you have a banner that opens and closes. You can't assume that it's always going to be the same on page load as it is when you hover. So we got these nav chords as well. Let's console log those. Good. We've got that. And then what we need to do is figure out where are the chords for everything. So we're going to put those 2 coordinates that we just got together. Const chords is equal to, and then the height is just going to be equal to the drop down chords dot height, and the width is also going to be drop down chords dot width. Let's just stop it there and work with the width and the height before we get any further. So now that we have the width and the height here, we can just take our background, which is that white thing. We can set the style, and we'll say dot set property. And we're going to set the property, the width, to be chords dot width. And we're also going to do that with the height. And that doesn't seem to be working. How come? Because you need to give it pixels. So you could just wrap these suckers in a template string and add px to the end. That should do it for us. Look at this. So when you hover it, it will know how big and how wide that actual element is. And that's another reason why we do that sort of two-stage adding trigger enter and trigger active, so that when you enter it, even though it's not shown on the page, it's display block, and we're able to get these bounding client rects from it. Because otherwise, if it was hidden, you can't tell the width and the height of a hidden element. So it needs to be on the page, even if it's visibly not there with opacity. So we've got our width and our height. And the reason why that is animating itself, if we go up to our CSS here, you see this drop down background. I have a transition of the opacity is half a second, and then everything else is 0.3 seconds, and the translate is 0.2 seconds. So if I make that 2 seconds and make this one 3 seconds, the width and the height will just take 2 seconds to actually grow. But you want that to be nice and short, and you can kind of play around with how nicely that goes. Good. So that's working. And then the last piece of the puzzle is actually working with the top and the left values. So if we go back down here, we say the top is going to be, let's just say drop down chords dot top. And the left is going to be the same thing. And then we have to go down here and set our transform, because this is a CSS property, is going to be, normally it would be translate, and we would give it our X and our Y. But in our case, it's going to be chords dot left px, comma, chords top. So give that a save. Seems to be working. But if I were to go up here, again, just do what we did before and maybe put like a H2, say like cool. Now, see how everything is messed up? And that's because the coordinates that we get are off a little bit because that navigation is pushed down. So you can't always assume that everything's going to be anchored to the top of the actual page. And that's why we've went ahead and grabbed this nav coordinates right here, because we need to take our drop-down chords and then offset them with the top nav. So if the top nav is 30 pixels, we know it's been bumped down 30 pixels. So the value, the top of this white box, needs to be moved up 30 pixels. And same for the left nav chords dot left. And those two values are just going to offset them, and it's going to perfectly put itself. Aha! Buttery smooth. You've got it going on. This is probably the hardest part that took me a while to figure out. When you have something nested inside of it, these values don't care, and you need to do the math yourself. That's one thing that jQuery did really nice for you. If you ever use .offset inside of jQuery, you didn't have to worry about it because it did all the math behind the scenes for you there. Other than that, working really nicely for us. There is one little thing where if you sort of go bananas on it, take the nav, the UL, open this up. You see, like why is there trigger enter active here? And if you like really mess with it, like go really quickly, you'll see like, okay, sometimes you see the content before you actually get to it. And then if you mess with it, sometimes you're going to end up with an active here. And what's happening is that it's this set timeout here. Immediately when we enter, we're going to add a class of trigger enter. And then 150 milliseconds later, we're going to enter trigger enter active. But sometimes I'm already hovering off before this is even added. So there's a bit of a problem here where you try to remove the active one before it's ever been added. So you run the remove, and then a little bit later, you actually add it on. That's a bit of a pain. So what we want to do is take this function that we're running here, put that into its own, and we'll say if this .class list .contains trigger enter, then we want to add the class of active. And then you can see it. You can just go to crazy with it, and you see that you're never seeing the content too early because that active one is never being added, and you never see them on here. Another way that I like to write it is it's a little bit more, it's a little bit shorter, where we'll take it back to what we have here. Take that, take the if statement out, take this block out that we had here, bring it back to that arrow function. And what you can do is you say this.class list that contains trigger enter and this class.add. And that's sort of short circuiting this, where if this is true, then this will run. If this is false, then it doesn't bother checking the second one. So it's a bit of a hack there where you take advantage of this Boolean and, but that means that the add will never run unless it actually contains trigger enter. It's just like the if statement that we have there. And things. Oh no, I broke it. Token. We got too many tokens. Is it that one? Maybe. Yes. There we go. Working nicely for us. So hopefully you enjoyed that one. I really liked it. I think that the people that work at Stripe, they have, if you look into it, if you notice, like when you just hover into it, they have this like really cool sort of fold down effect that they have going on. And I think that their code is probably 6 or 7 times as large as this. But if this is something that you love working with, which is coordinates and timing and all of that, I would definitely encourage you to try and make that little fold down animation work as well. Thanks so much, and I will see you tomorrow.